Great. I think we'll probably get started. So before we do get started, I just want to do the usual thanks for our partners and supporters. And like most of the series projects, susdrain doesn't happen without the support from our partners and supporters. So this is a breakdown of our partners and supporters. So I just wanted to thank them. And you can find out more about susdrain and our partners and supporters by visiting our website, which is www.susdrain.org. And if you would like to get involved in the work that we undertake at susdrain and Syria, please do get in touch after the event. So I'm Paul Schaffer. I coordinate the work that Syria undertakes on blue-green infrastructure, which includes our work on SuDS and susdrain. And susdrain is a project that we set up to share good practice on SuDS with the hope to inspire, inform, and influence delivery. And this webcast is the last of a series of 4 webcasts covering the SuDS pillars. And the SuDS pillars are a set of high-level objectives and benefits for SuDS. And these include managing the quantity and quality of runoff and creating better places for people and nature through delivering amenity and biodiversity. We've covered all of these topics, or we will be covering all of these topics once we finish today, and I've been joined gladly by a number of experts for each of the SuDS pillars, and the intention is that they will share their thoughts on the opportunities, challenges and practice with regards to the delivery of the SuDS and the specific SuDS pillars. So today's webcast is about delivering biodiversity, and I think generally there's a general perception that maybe amenity and biodiversity are less regarded with regards to SuDS, with flood risk and water quality taking the limelight. But designing for biodiversity has a fundamental impact on the quality of our spaces and places for people and also nature. And biodiversity is crucial in terms of underpinning very many of those multiple benefits we're looking for with SuDS. So what were the challenges around biodiversity decline in the country and emerging regulations on biodiversity? And again, this webcast is a really good opportunity to explore the interactions between biodiversity and SuDS and see how we can get the most out of both SuDS and biodiversity, and also what that relationship might look like with biodiversity net gain coming forward in the next few years. So in terms of how it's going to work, you probably gathered by now that the attendees are in listen-only mode, and the webcast is being recorded and will be available later as a YouTube video and also hopefully as a podcast going forward. So there will be plenty of opportunity, we hope, for discussion at the end. And if you are having problems with connection, please raise your hand and my colleague Hanifa will be in touch. And there will also be an opportunity for questions and answers. So please use this option and type in your question. And there's also an opportunity to upvote the questions, and wherever possible, we will try and actually take the most popular question coming through. I will monitor the questions and we will do what we can to make sure we cover as many of these questions as possible. And we hope to finish within the hour. So there's a number of polls that we're doing today, and our first poll is coming up now. Okay, so this poll is: what role do you have in SuDS delivery? So are you approver, practitioner, designer, developer, client, or other? Interesting. I will stop the polling now, as over 60% of you have voted. And okay, evenly split between those involved in approval and practitioner. I think earlier in the week we've had probably more practitioners, so that's great. So that's really good. So looking at the program, pretty straightforward. And today's webcast on biodiversity, I'm delighted to say I've been joined by Dr. Julia Baker, who is the biodiversity technical specialist at Balfour Beatty. Julia is lead author of the UK's Good Practice Principles for Biodiversity Net Gain and has designed and implemented biodiversity net gain on a variety of developments, from major infrastructure to small housing developments. Julia runs professional training courses on biodiversity net gain and is on the Natural England sounding board for the biodiversity metric. So pretty much Julia will provide us with an overview of SuDS and biodiversity, explaining what works, what doesn't, and then we hope to be able to have a bit more of a conversation, a bit more of a discussion that will be fueled by your questions. So please do raise those questions, and it'd be great to take that forward, because otherwise it'd just be left to myself and Julia to talk about the things that concern us, which might not be the things that concern you. So we will, as I say, we'll be interspersed with a few polls, and our next poll is coming up now. So what is the greatest barrier to designing SuDS with biodiversity benefits? Lack of policy requirements, lack of on-the-ground enforcement of policy requirements, lack of technical standards, lack of practical guidance, or lack of skills and expertise. Okay, so the most popular is lack of policy requirements, which has got 30% of the votes, and that's closely followed by lack of on-the-ground enforcement of policy requirements, 22%. And lack of skills and expertise comes in again at 22% as well. So it looks like a lack of policy requirements and lack of skills and expertise could be the challenges that we're facing. So without further ado, I will pass over to Julia.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Paul, can you hear me okay? Just to check that? Yeah, great. Okay. Let's check this is working. Right. Yeah, really interesting poll. So you're right, everybody. There is a lot of guidance out there, and we've been talking about a well-designed SuDS that does the job of SuDS, but also delivers biodiversity benefits. And there's guidance and there's some really great case studies, but it's not yet mainstream. It hasn't landed yet. And there's a number of barriers out there. It's really interesting the way that you're pointed to a clear lack of policy direction on this. And one of the things that I think is a barrier is that the way that SuDS actually should be used for day-to-day water management. You know, they tend to be focused where there might be a flood risk or flood control. Oh, that's a SuDS solution. But actually, we need to change the perceptions of SuDS. They really are that day-to-day for water management, and then really pick up these guides, these very practical resources, that learning from the case study to design SuDS, that function of SuDS, and with biodiversity benefits. But we're not there yet. We're not there. And there's an interesting question now with the forthcoming Environment Bill. So it's working its way through Parliament, and Part 6, Nature and Biodiversity, is a biodiversity gain in planning. So this will mandate biodiversity gain as a condition of planning permission for development in England. So we know that's coming, and there's been a lot of discussion about biodiversity net gain in general and about what the Environment Bill might look like. We don't know all the details of it, but I think in relation to SuDS, there's an interesting question here. Will this mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain incentivize SuDS, the design, the delivery, the maintenance of SuDS, that again, that function of SuDS, but also benefit biodiversity? And I think this is a conversation to have now, right now, so that we put in place the safeguards, the measures to make sure that this does work in the best possible way. And I'd like to bring out a couple of things, and I'll be interested in your thoughts as we go through the presentation, of the key aspects that I think that we could really harness and make the most of this opportunity. And just to double check a few things. So what is biodiversity net gain? It's development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than before. And it's so important to recognize that definition, because it means that because that development has happened, and that might be a housing development or mixed use or commercial development or road or railway or energy, because that's happened, biodiversity is better off. You know, so it's fundamentally not about business as usual and making sure that the numbers stack up at the end of it. It's a fundamentally different way of investing, planning, designing, and building development. Now, it is the word measurably that certainly I'm interested in. And we have a beta test version of the biodiversity metric by Natural England. And we're expecting the revised version, the updated version next year. And now, in case some of you aren't familiar with this biodiversity metric, it works based on habitats. So it looks at a variety of attributes of habitats before your work. So that's the type, the condition, their location, and it calculates what's called habitat units, and it does the same for hedgerows, line of trees and rivers as well. So you get a calculation, you get a score of units before works, and then the process of biodiversity net gain is to go through what's called the mitigation hierarchy, where you avoid and minimize loss from the outset. And then it will calculate your units after work. So again, it's very habitat based. It's the type, condition, of quality. And what's interesting about the Environment Bill is that it gives us a numerical definition of biodiversity net gain. And it says that as a minimum, we want a 10% increase. So effectively, biodiversity net gain is about habitats. And you've really got two options to achieve it. You're either going to be creating more habitats or making existing habitats better. But let's think about this question. So will biodiversity net gain incentivize SuDS with biodiversity benefits? So the first point, fundamentally the first point, is they have to be featured in the metric, because that's the mandatory approach. That's the metric that we're going to be using. And the revised metric that, the beta test version of metric that we have at the moment, SuDS do feature. So there are certainly various SuDS that do feature in the metric, and that's certainly positive. So we're making a step towards this optimum place, if you like. The problem that I have with this, if you look at what's called distinctiveness, it's pretty low. Now, distinctiveness ranges from very low and low, and you see the score there too, up to high and very high, which is a 6 or an 8. So fundamentally, we're starting off on quite a low bar. So even if there is a development with SuDS that generates really interesting biodiversity features within an urban landscape, it might score poorly. And that can be an issue. You know, if SuDS score poorly within the biodiversity metric, I think that it will be a lack of an incentive to count towards biodiversity net gain. And that's really what we need. We need that place where SuDS are recognised enough and actually count in the metric towards biodiversity net gain. And if they don't, you know, where's the incentive to think about the design of SuDS with biodiversity benefits? There's another problem. I think it might actually be a disincentive. You know, if a developer's really looking at, okay, we've got a mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain. If I design SuDS really well with biodiversity benefits, then there's some great biodiversity value there, but why should I bother if they score poorly within the metric? And this is going to be a fundamental problem unless we address it. And that comes down to my next point, is that, well, that in the worst case, that might actually drive the water management underground, because we have to have space for biodiversity net gain. Now, when you work on biodiversity net gain projects, fundamentally, the first conversation that I have with a developer is about space. We need space. Remember the two options to get to biodiversity net gain, either enhancing habitats or creating new habitats. We need space to do that. And both biodiversity net gain and SuDS need space. So how will that fit in with a development footprint? And if it won't, then we need to look at offsetting options, but that should only be as a last resort. Now, I want to highlight an example of where this can work really well. So we've just finished a scheme actually, and it was a SuDS improvement scheme. They were pretty old, they hadn't been maintained for a while. So the work at Balfour Beatty, we were coming in, we're doing a bit of excavation, digging them out, and putting back a sort of new and improved SuDS back in. And I always find it quite useful when you have these projects to look at, okay, well, what's the project as it is? What's the design? And let's run that through the metric. And that's what the do nothing scenario, if you like. So they're not doing anything for biodiversity net gain. They've just got the design and we're running that through the metric. Now, looking at the existing design, under that do nothing for biodiversity net gain, they had a pretty basic, it was a kind of amenity wet grassland mix in there. And that resulted in a minus 8.5% in biodiversity units. So we were early enough in this conversation, and we were early enough to speak with a designer, and we looked at that grassland mix, and we looked at different options for that, and we worked with a couple of local nurseries, and we got a bit more of an ecologically rich mix, if you like. So the second scenario is do something for biodiversity net gain. So we did something, we changed the mix, and that was the only thing that we changed. And under the metric, we went from a minus 8.5% in units to a plus 5%, and that's no extra cost. So it is possible. There are opportunities there, and it is about having that conversation early and really getting in there. And that's such an important case study of the way that we can do this. So yes, they're still on their way to net gain, but it was perfectly possible, and there were no extra cost to the scheme design or to the maintenance afterwards. But space is at a premium when it comes to both biodiversity net gain and SuDS. And the other thing I'd like to just discuss is that rightly so, people are kind of fixated on the 10%, and I love that. You know, I love the way that we're talking about achieving a 10% in net gain, and considering where we've been and where we've come from with the whole ecology mindset, if you like, about holding up works, to now talking about the 10% is excellent. But it's not just about the 10%. It's how we get there. And how we get there, we have some great good practice principles in biodiversity net gain that were published back in 2016, and they really underpin what good looks like when it comes to biodiversity net gain. Now, fundamentally, a fundamental part of those practice principles is what's called like for like or like for better. If you lose woodland, or you've got a project going through the mitigation hierarchy, it has an impact on woodland, we've got to stick within the same broad habitat type as a starting point. So woodland losses equals woodland net gains, grassland losses equals grassland net gains. It's not about swapping habitats, unless there's fundamentally a really great ecology reason to do so. And for example, that can be within the very, very low grade ecology habitats. Yes, you might have more flexibility, but essentially biodiversity net gain is not to transform the natural environment, it's to really enhance it. And I love the way that we have this very structured approach with biodiversity net gain, but that's difficult in urban areas. And there are so many great projects coming through in urban areas with a variety of greening up features that is so interesting and inventive, and certainly very welcome. But fundamentally, it can't replace certain core habitat types such as woodland. And I think there's a risk that we rely too much on the numbers, and we lose key habitats in very urban locations like the last remaining trees or that patch. And the numbers tot up because we have some great SuDS in there. I'm not taking away the value of SuDS, but that's not true good practice. And we need to make that very clear, particularly in these urban locations where SuDS are very, very valuable, but we need to still stick on that very structured approach for biodiversity net gain. So biodiversity net gain in SuDS, I think it's such a great opportunity that's coming our way. This is on our doorstep. Designing SuDS with biodiversity benefits has been such a long-standing issue, and we're really not there yet in terms of that becoming mainstream. So this mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain could be that real opportunity that we're after. But I think there's some fundamental points that we need to absolutely get in place. SuDS needs to be properly valued in the biodiversity metric. And the one thing that I would say about that is that I know that Natural England have looked at all urban habitats in the biodiversity metric as part of their revision for what will become the 2021 metric. So do look out for that, but we fundamentally need SuDS to be properly valued in that way. We need clear guidance on the role of SuDS, particularly when it comes to like for like or better, so we don't get those in appropriate situations where we've lost a last remaining patch of woodland within an urban location, and it's been swapped out for the units generated by SuDS, that completely ecologically different function and different habitat type. So that there's a role there, particularly for SuDS, to have that clear guidance. And plan both early space. You know, space is at such a premium when we come to these developments. And I've certainly worked with developers that are keen to max out every inch of land for those extra housing units or for those extra commercial units. And now I'm talking to them about, hang on, we need space for biodiversity net gain. And where do they put the SuDS as well? That can work if we plan those very, very early on. Okay, Paul, back to you.
Marvelous. Just trying to unmute myself. Thank you, Julia, for that. Brilliant. So, as I said, we've got some questions going, and there's a few there, and there's opportunities there for you to vote on those as well. But while you're thinking about questions and voting, also just trying to see if you can do some multitasking. We've got another poll for you. So, listen to what Julia said, that we're trying to think about what you think is possible. So should it be possible for SuDS to count towards biodiversity net gain? Okay, so we've got over 60% of you there. So reassuringly, all of you bar one have said yes. So I suppose really the question for me, Julia, would be, whilst it's great to see them being recognised in the metric, are there any thoughts as to, will there be any guidance about how some of design principles for SuDS relating to scoring more highly in terms of distinctiveness and what have you, has that been thought about, or is the biodiversity metric kind of open for consultation and discussion and evolution as things progress?
Yeah, so Natural England did hold a consultation on the biodiversity metric, actually on the beta version, and you know, that ran last year, and I know that they got a lot of feedback on the urban habitats in general, certainly. So and you know, watching that consultation that's come out, I know that they've been looking to revise that. We don't know yet what the final results will be, but I think there's just such a specific and important discussion that we should have about the whole role of SuDS with the mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain. And it's certainly that the metric should recognise them appropriately, but then in the SuDS guidance, I think there's the link there that should make, you know, all this guidance that's out there about designing SuDS that function as SuDS, but also for biodiversity benefits. There needs to be that specific discussion, and it needs to sit in that SuDS world.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely a meeting of minds needs to happen in terms of both the guidance and biodiversity for developments and guidance for delivering SuDS about the value and merit of biodiversity, and using the biodiversity net gain as a metric to actually evaluate some of that. Certainly if we're thinking about potentially revising the non-statutory standards in England, that might include that. So it'd be good to get that streamlined. So if we move on to some of our first questions. So we've got a question here from Lee Moritz. It says, in Scotland, I find the main challenge is getting developers to recognise that SuDS, biodiversity and landscaping can all work together on a site. Is there any case studies or points of reference for where we can send developers during pre-application discussions for planning? I doubt that's not just limited to Scotland, Lee. You're on mute still, Julia.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, case studies, there's such a power in case studies, there really is, and it's such a great question. And I think there's a real need for honest, I always think honest case studies, you know, and you know, we're probably quite guilty of it here. You know, you want the glory of the case studies and things to work really well, and things are really tough in that situation and that learning. I've only seen anecdotal ones here and there, and actually what I would point you to is actually in the SuDS guidance that's talk about wildlife benefits and designing SuDS. wildlife benefits, they've dropped in several quite interesting case studies and examples. So if you kind of go to those references, and I've got a couple on the slides that we can maybe point to in a follow-up email. They're all available on the internet, so, so kind of Google SuDS and biodiversity. But in those references, not only do you get some really interesting help and advice, but you also get some interesting stories about projects that have come through.
Great, brilliant. So there was just a supplemental addition to that. So I'm just trying to see if I can open it up, from Mark Jackson, who says that his colleague Dave West has an article published in practice with 5 case studies of biodiversity net gain in multifunctional landscapes in development, including SuDS. So they are out there. I suppose we're just not doing enough to highlight them. And they're within the susdrain bed of case studies. There will also be a number of good examples of biodiversity. But I think it comes down to the point that Julia made before about the stages of engagement and making sure that consultation happens really early, and that's been relevant and clear in all the earlier SuDS pillar talks that we've had previously about the value of discussion.
And I'll tell you what, the numbers really help. I've been knocking on doors for so long trying to get the biodiversity flag raised really early, and I've been very jealous of my sustainability colleagues who you've got a carbon calculator or a waste, or finally I've got a metric, because numbers are a great communication tool, particularly when you're working with developers and they've got either engineers or architects, and it's just that. So I try and run the metric as early as possible, do nothing, do something, very, very simple scenarios. And it's not the best data, but it's something to have that conversation. And I find it very useful. And then you can really look at how SuDS can play a part in that.
Great. Thank you for that, Julia, and thank you for that supplemental add-on. So there's a question here that's come in quite highly in terms of 15 votes for it, and it links to the question I raised earlier. Do SuDS score poorly because they don't provide that much biodiversity, or because the metrics are wrong?
Yeah, yes, great question. So personal opinion on this, and believe me, the way the metric's set up, it has that first, it scores habitats on several different variables, and that first one that I showed you, distinctiveness, and that's preset. And distinctiveness is really interesting. It's like this blended mix of the rarity of the habitat, whether it's a priority habitat status, and SuDS always kind of fall down the line on that one. So while distinctiveness works really well for certain habitats, when you have SuDS that genuinely have a great biodiversity value, because of the criteria behind distinctiveness, which is more in favor of those nature conservation features that we all know and love, it tends to drop down a little bit. So it's not at all about the potential of SuDS to benefit biodiversity. It's just the way that the metric's built. But I do know, again, the Natural England have been looking at this and have been wanting to revise that. So it's certainly something that's been picked up on and looked at. But I think it just won't work. We won't get the true benefits of how a mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain can truly incentivize those SuDS design if SuDS score too poorly in a metric. We sort of tripped up before we start.
Great, thanks, Julia. So we have a question here from James Allen, and he says, we know that both the water and local authorities will be responsible for the adoption of SuDS, but where will the future maintenance and improvement costs come from? I think there's more of a question about maintenance and where will the funding streams come from?
Yeah, I can talk about what we know about the mandatory approach for biodiversity net gain, which isn't a great deal. So under the Environment Bill, and again, this is just England, and it's just developments going through the planning permission, so it's not everything. They've set a 30-year timeline. So whatever's in your metric, if you like, and that's your biodiversity net gain, it's got a 30-year timeline for that. Now, there's a lot of questions about proof of evidence on the ring fence funding to get you your planning permission, because you can have the metric, that's great, but will it actually happen? And as yet we don't know all of the details. I can certainly describe case studies or projects that I've been involved with where developers have either secured that funding with the third party, and they've got a contract and an agreement, and that goes as part of the planning permission. Sometimes it's wrapped up in a section 106, but then we get on questions about, well, how enforceable is this and things like that. So there's certainly a lot of questions around that as the Environment Bill that we just don't have answers to until the Environment Bill comes out. We do know that there will be a biodiversity net gain register. So that will be a register of biodiversity net gain sites publicly available. And there will be more resources for local planning authorities and a watchdog about this as well. So from the sound of things and the sort of the conversations that are happening, it's all pointing in the right direction. But after space, the other thing that I talked to the developers about with biodiversity net gain is that funding. Definitely, we need to lock that down.
And it's a similar issue for the SuDS, regardless of how much biodiversity there is. How will the schemes be maintained in perpetuity, and how will that income be coming in to cover that? So I don't think it's necessarily an issue that's going to go away that quickly, but it just needs to be dealt with. Right, so we have a question here from Amy Scott, and I think it might be a few that some of the audience will recognise. As an ecologist, I struggle to come to an agreement with developers who are fixed with their design, especially regarding landscaping. Will or should biodiversity net gain training be rolled out to all parties involved? And there's a supplemental here, and it said also, will there be training for those installing and maintaining the features, i.e. someone mowing the meadow too short to make it look nice for sales?
Oh, training and capability is it's a great question. It's something that I'm very close to my heart, actually. I mean, I think it's not just a challenge for the ecology industry to upskill ourselves. Like 30 years, we've got to design this stuff for 30 years. We've always worked on such a short timeline. But yeah, developers, and I meet so many ecologists who are actually going through those conversations about what does biodiversity net gain mean? What does it look like? You've got a locked design that doesn't deliver that 10%. And I have those projects all the time. I think it will be a matter of time. There's not going to be any quick fix. And I say that because we're asking for such a fundamental change. Developers been in that place of mitigating damage on ecology, and that's okay because I can get consent from that, to one of fundamentally designing development that benefits the natural environment. And it will take time. And to come back to your question, we're working with a number of different professional organisations on training. There's certainly a lot of discussions being happening. I better not say everything just in case I'm not allowed to. But please be aware, and please know that there's a lot of discussions, a lot of talks happening about that very remit. So yeah.
And likewise, there is training going forward on SuDS as well in terms of trying to deliver those multiple benefits. Great. Okay. So there's a question here from Andrew Chua, and apologies for the appalling pronunciation. How do we encourage statutory undertakers such as water companies who usually construct under permitted development to invest more in improving biodiversity when the primary drivers for construction SuDS is usually water quantity and or quality?
Yeah, I mean, how do we get this through, and I just think we'll never do this if we rely on legislation. Legislation has a part to play, absolutely, but we'll truly do biodiversity net gain and the role that SuDS can play in that if it's something that businesses want to do, that it makes smart business sense. And to do that, I found that I've had to understand that whatever business that might be, so it's a particular water company, I really understand what makes them tick before I start talking about, this is biodiversity net gain, isn't it great? And I've just spent time with particular developers, and sometimes you'll have a conversation that doesn't go anywhere for a while, and then it picks up. And again, it comes back to, I find numbers really help in that way. And even with permitted development, there is genuinely pressures on time and budget and cost, but there is also a sense of moving in the direction of sustainable development. And I think COVID has really shone a light on that for so many people, you know, in such a personal way, that people that I didn't think would ever, you know, want to talk to me about biodiversity net gain are suddenly having a bit more of a discussion. So I kind of want to say, you know, numbers definitely help, and keep chugging away. I've not had any real like magic, you know, one step moments. It's always been a series of little moments within a company that's just generally built up a momentum. And I mean, this is just very personal, but I try to work very much at the grassroots level. You know, sometimes you need that top down kind of CEO, you know, step in. But I think if you can work with people on the ground and really understand what they're worried about, where they're coming from, you can try and make some ground there. But it can be a slow process, but it's always worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I think that there's focus here on maybe water companies, and I think water companies are fast realizing that they have also got a contract with the public in terms of the work that they're doing. So they also need to be thinking about some of the multiple benefit that goes with some of their interventions. So they might be thinking about, actually, we need to be contributing to better quality of life for some of these people, and it might be around biodiversity. It might be also around how they're embracing natural capital accounting as well. So there might be opportunities for them to be able to find a business case and justification for biodiversity, as well as it being supported by something that they should be doing for their customers and for the communities that they're working in.
Yeah, and just a really quick follow up. So the one thing that I do find works really, really well is if you can get a case study. So for a particular company, even if it's just something little, it's one of their projects that you've tested this on. Because it, you know, I do talk about this a lot, but there's nothing more though that this is one of their projects. So even if, you know, we've done a couple of, look, can we just work with you on a very quick calculation to just see how this would look like, and they've got something very tangible but also quite personal to their company then, and that can work quite well.
Cool. Great, thank you for that question and the answer, Julia. There's a question here, it's quite technical, but it's asking, is there any evidence available on the attenuation infiltration benefits that certain species or planting can have in SuDS features such as basins or swales?
Gosh, I'd have to check the literature about that. I've certainly read some fantastic work. Natural England got a lot of great publications about different habitat types. The Environment Agency have a couple of publications as well. So maybe let's take that one away.
Yeah, no, I think these tend to be more scientific, academic research papers that get undertaken. So it might be worth looking at some of the outputs from universities like Sheffield University, and maybe what university in Scotland as well. They might be looking at some of this detail. And okay, yeah, and someone suggested have a look at the work coming up from Plymouth in terms of woodlands as well. So there is a body of evidence of work coming around working with natural processes, which looks at natural flood management regards, but I don't think it's necessarily on planting types. I think it's more about land use. But I think it probably requires a bit more of an academic research, because I know that some of the universities have been looking at how hydrology can be impacted by soil type and vegetation. Okay, so thank you for that question.
Good one.
Right, so there's a question here from Stefan Thorgerson that asks, has the monetary value of biodiversity for developers been researched empirically? Has data been collected, for example, on land value as a function of some kind of biodiversity index?
Oh yeah, nothing. There's the unit, so you have numbers, and then there's monetary value, which goes even further, you know, if you're trying to have that engagement piece. The thing that I would point to that I've used really quite well, actually, the natural capital accounts. So an amazing company, FTech, worked on an approach called corporate natural capital accounting, and they've done a couple of very specific natural capital accounts for biodiversity net gains, looking at habitat losses and gains, and looking at you know, what are the gains in monetary value in terms of pollution uptake, carbon, flooding, recreation, things like this. I'm not sure, I think they published it as well, but and DEFRA has done a little bit of work about the impact costs and biodiversity net gain as well. It's not quite what you're asking for, But I found those natural capital accounts, really looking at the monetary value of like you're saying, land prices, but also so much more about what that biodiversity means into all those services that we use. A very, very powerful way of doing so. So again, there's a number of case studies out there, but it's in the natural capital accounting world.
Yeah, and Stefan, if you look on to the susdrain website and look at resources and look at BEST, which is the benefits estimation tool, within there is an opportunity for blue-green infrastructure to be assessed on biodiversity, and there might be some metrics in there that you can use in terms of a financial quantification of the benefits. So it might be worth having a look there. Okay, here's a question from Peter Coombs, who says 10% net gain seems very low for a brownfield site. Should sites be segmented between brownfield, greenfield, and based upon the end use of the project, where some will have greater potential? And likewise, Julia, is there, when we've had discussions around the need for amenity and biodiversity, some people have said, actually, you don't need biodiversity and amenity everywhere. There's certain places where it's not necessary. How do you deal with that kind of discussion as well in terms of appropriate biodiversity?
Yeah, so 10%, I don't know, but I would imagine that so one of the reasons for that 10% was consistency across the board. So one of the advantages of the Environment Bill coming in is that it's fantastic, the work that's being done about biodiversity net gain, but there's a lot of inconsistencies between different developers, between different consultants, between different local planning authorities. And, we've just got to bring it together, particularly for us in England, and work on a consistent basis. So they wanted to set that level playing field, so right, 10%. What I would say is that 10% is a relative target. So it's 10% on your baseline. So if you've got quite a valuable baseline, or one that's not so valuable, it is relative in that way, and it's really down to the specific way. And we've just seen on SuDS that we've got to make sure that that habitat's properly recognised in the metric, and that's the fundamentally important part. If the mandated approach is based on the metric as well as good practice, and that minimum 10%, so it's not a cap, it's a minimum, it really comes down to how good those metrics are. So I don't think Natural England or DEFRA would probably be open to sort of variety and changing that just for the consistency point. The other point is what we need in terms of the nature recovery networks that are coming through. So again, 10% is great, I love it, but it's not the answer to stop biodiversity loss. And I say that because we're only making habitats 10% better. We're not getting them to the best ultimate place that they can be. So it's going to be a step in the way. And we need to keep in mind that ultimate target, and that is looking at a local planning authority and these nature recovery networks that are talked about in the environment plan. That should hold those absolute targets, those endpoints, and then we can map progress to say, okay, we've got 10%, we've got another 10%, and where are we within the map to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. And and the amenity biodiversity kind of way up. I've had so much interesting discussions recently, and actually just come off a call with a great ecology and landscape design team who is so integrated. And this does tend to be for the bigger projects, but it has to be that integrated design approach when, as professionals, they're all talking about their wish list, their ambitions, and they're working out, okay, where is the best place? And actually, for heavily used public places, there's going to be pressures on biodiversity, so we need to create some space for biodiversity over here, and that's just part of the design process. And that standards really come into a role with that. What the client puts in the tender, we find to be absolutely key. We will build what they want, but they've got to want it, so we've got to have that specification in the tender as well as the policy requirements for a local planning authority. So there are these number of pieces that need to happen to make the best outcomes on site.
Great, thank you for that response. We're moving, I think before you mentioned about the potential disincentive or challenge with regards to biodiversity net gain, and someone's made reference here to where we work, we get storage tanks underground, and meadow areas created on top of them to achieve habitat units. It may be cheaper for the developer to do this in order to use the smallest area of land and pay for off-site delivery of residual habitat units, as it's probably still cheaper to do this. How would you, in this situation, Julia, how would your discussions with the developer go in terms of encouraging a more integrated approach?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, you've got to, it starts off with understanding their reasons why. People always do things for a certain reason. Yep. And I think we kind of just jump in without listening and really understanding reasons why and just asking questions. And I don't know that particular case study, but, you know, some of the fact, sometimes it's just because they've always done that. And, you know, there is another way of doing this type conversation, and to lead them gently through that. And to just look at, well, what are their reasons why? Mm-hmm. What's the drivers? Are they worried about this is going to be an additional cost burden? I get that a lot. You know, I get so many people saying that it's going to be too expensive. And when you drill down, they have no idea actually about the maintenance cost. They're just assuming, you know, It's going to be more expensive. So case studies, evidence, actually saying to them, well, this is the management regime and it's not going to cost anything more, those kind of things. So you've got to understand the reasons why, first of all, and then really look at, well, what would be the way of doing so? And, you know, if it does come down to cost, then you've got to test that out and see, well, is this different approach going to cost them more money, or and go from there? I mean, it's got to be site specific. It's got to be specific to the developer as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll just thank you for that response on that question. I've just been scrolling down the questions, and there's a question that tends to crop up in terms of maintenance regimes and considering the habitat and the species that they're there. So this is a question from Steve Halls, and he said, take into account the integrated multifunctional approach, which is key to SuDS ethos. There will be conflicts regarding optimum management and maintenance regimes going forward. We will need clear guidance on how we maintain the serviceability and amenity of or usable space without cutting a newt in half. How do we maintain the net biodiversity metric? Will ecology surveys be required prior to maintenance?
Gosh, yeah, quite blunt.
Yeah,
yeah, it's such an important question, and I think so. Thinking about the 30-year timeline with biodiversity net gain, you know, we're just, as ecologists, we're just not used to working on that timescale. You know, 30 years, and we do run these training courses with ecologists, and I kind of always ask, well, how many of you have written that management plan for that length of time? And hardly any have. So there's a process there, not only to upskill ourselves as an industry, but then to have that integrated design approach, not just at the design stage, but also at the maintenance stage. And it's such a great question, because we won't really do this. You know, if we have a great design, if we have a great metric, and I think it's so pertinent to SuDS, because I've seen some great SuDS designs, then you get to site a couple of years later, it's just like, you know, what has gone on? And it's that carry through, and to make sure the maintenance is in the right hands, if possible, or it comes back to that training point as well, that there's training to go on, and that thinking at the start. To give you some hope, we are working on these long-term plans right early on, and actually getting their business as usual maintenance regime, and then just kind of marrying it up with, okay, we'll change that one slightly, we'll change that one slightly. And I'm always struck by the fact these aren't fundamental changes. They are important changes, but, you know, there's nothing fundamentally different. It's maybe changing the timing of a mowing regime, or, like someone said, changing the depth of the mowing. And you know, if you do get the opportunity to work on that one-to-one basis, that's the best way. But I think the point that you're making about guidance is going to be key as well. You know, not just for biodiversity net gain in the hands of the ecologists to write these 30-year management plans, but when you get these features such as SuDS that have to function as SuDS, you know, that they are there to function as SuDS, and then we want the additional biodiversity benefits as well.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Julie. During many of our discussions about the achieving of multiple benefits, the discussion around site size and difficult sites come up. Is there a cutoff point at where biodiversity net gain will not apply in terms of actually, or is it any site? Is it a site over a certain area or?
Well, there is work being done. Oh, it's a bit of a news story on a small site metric by Natural England, and that will work on a metre squared and a metres basis. So while that's very welcome, and it won't only just work on a metre squared and metres basis, it will be a simplified version of the main metric. So at the moment, a lot of ecologists using the main metric will use the minimum mapping unit of a phase 1 or a UK HAB or something like that to go from, and those main metrics work in hectares. But I think it's going to come out kind of spring next year, that small site metric. So it can go down to the smallest sites. The one thing I would say is that small site metric is for I think the definition of small developers is in the Town and Country Planning Act, less than half a hectare or something like that, which is quite extraordinary. So we're going to be asking developers less than half a hectare of land to do biodiversity net gain, but we're not asking nationally significant infrastructure projects to do it because they don't follow planning consent. But I'll stop, otherwise I'll start ranting about that particular point. So probably best to move on.
To move on. Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's just a question that comes out quite a lot when we're talking about SuDS, is how do you get amenity and biodiversity in small sites? So I just wonder whether there's a question that's come up with the biodiversity.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So there's a question here that's quite popular, but I'm not quite sure we can answer it here. Has the impact of woodland been used as SuDS features been researched, and if so, can it be quantified in modelling? This is from Christian McIntosh. So I would look at some work that's come out from the Environment Agency, DEFRA, on working with natural processes. And again, I think there'd be quite a lot of work there about different types of woodlands. I think this is where we start moving into different definitions of measures. So woodland is currently being considered in some work that we're doing on guidance on natural flood management, and I'm sure research has been undertaken. It's just where to find that. And again, someone suggested about the research from Plymouth in terms of woodlands. So
just a quick one. Kind of watch this space. There's some really interesting research coming out of Kent University, so that they've taken a whole lot of biodiversity net gain applications from 3 or 4 local councils and just seeing, what's happening, what are people doing, and there's some really important finding there about the swapping of habitats. Sort of making up the numbers with, water features, because they're pretty, they gain the units quickly, whereas woodland takes longer, but also losing green space. I love the units and I think they're great, but we've got to keep a track of just the amount of green space that we have, because otherwise you could clear woodlands, and then even if you achieve your units by enhancing an existing patch of woodland, if every project does that, we're slowly losing woodland cover, and we're going to be left with a few remaining really great patches of woodland, which, we just don't want that. So yeah, do keep asking the question, keep that discussion live.
Yep, great. Thank you for that, Julia. So I think we've probably got time for one last point, and I think this comes down to terminology and what we call SuDS, so with regards to the biodiversity metric. So I think this is from Pete Frost, and he says, why classify SuDS as SuDS? Why not describe them as species-rich grassland, wet woodland, ponds, water meadows, fens, so forth? Is that an opportunity to help promote its importance with the metric, do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it is that narrow labeling and the fact that they're kind of bunched up in that urban category. Yeah, it hasn't helped at all. So the metrics based on UK HABs, that UK HAB classification as well. So the ecologists will actually, they should kind of disregard the metric and just get their habitat map absolutely right by following UK HABs. So it's a really nice way of actually thinking about, what is the right habitat classification? You can't retrofit this with the metric. You've got to get the habitat map right and valuing those habitats for habitats themselves. If they are then SuDS features, all well and good, but it's definitely, I've seen some really great habitat maps coming through that also happen to be, that is the SuDS feature, but it's the habitat in its own right. That comes back to the design. It really does.
And I think joining things up is probably going to be the mantra of covering some of these webcasts. I think there's a point here that Ingo Schuder's made around DEFRA, Natural England Environment Agency, needing to align better around biodiversity, biodiversity net gain, green infrastructure, and SuDS. And I think there's so much momentum going on in terms of the planning white paper and planning outcomes, design codes, manual for streets, biodiversity net gain. I don't know how we can seize this momentum and this opportunity to get some joined up thinking to make sure there's better outcomes for both nature, people, and planning. I don't know what we can do to help make that happen.
I think I always work at a pretty grassroots level, and just these conversations.
Yeah.
It's amazing the momentum that you can build with conversations. So even if out of everyone joining this webinar, it's incredible the numbers that we've got here today. Keep talking about the join up between SuDS and biodiversity net gain, and things do start to happen. People will start to integrate it in their design. We've certainly been calling on our project for that very specific guidance on the role that SuDS play with biodiversity net gain. There are some great forums, already about biodiversity net gain and already about SuDS. So it's just getting the right people in the right room. And I don't know, I work better at that level. Policy does come along a little bit later, but sometimes we need to just get going with it.
Exactly. I think it is those conversations and that vision as well, in terms of trying to sell a picture of what a well-designed scheme will look like that is good for biodiversity, is good for amenity, and delivers well on water quantity and water management aspects. So that's great. We've just got one last poll before we let you go, and this is about what's most important for mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement to incentivize multiple benefits SuDS approach. So this includes standards, practical guidance, case studies, higher scoring SuDS in the biodiversity metric, and clear policy links between mandatory biodiversity net gain and SuDS.
By the way, everyone, thank you so much for the polls. I know what it's like. It just kind of pops up. And Paul, you're sitting there with a timeline, about to press stop. So people have got to make this instant judgment. So thank you very much for voting. It's like pressure's on, it's like countdown.
Yeah, I'm just not quite sure. So I'm trying to do it by percentages. Once half of people
you're pretty harsh, Paul.
Am I?
I'll loads of people yet not to get voted yet.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you for those that did manage to vote. So at the moment the highest number is 51%. So this is for the clear policy links between mandatory biodiversity net gain and SuDS, and we're trying to do what we can at the moment when we're looking
Absolutely.
at updating the non-statutory technical standards, and there's still time to influence the biodiversity net gain. So I think one thing that's been clear is going forwards, Syria is seriously considering approaches to update the SuDS manual, and I think these discussions and these questions that come through, both from today's webcast and earlier webcast, have been really helpful in terms of trying to think about what we need to do. And I think there's clearly opportunity, and there's clearly some vision for that to happen, and there's enthusiasm for that. So that's really great. So apologies if I was harsh with the timekeeping. I will keep that in mind. The pauses here on this side of the table seem to be a lot greater. So I will bear in mind what it's like once you get thrusted with a dialogue box to complete. So I just want to thank Julia for the time to do the presentation and the time to answer those questions. I know it's been great. It's a bit fast flowing. I want to thank you for your questions. They've been really good, really helpful. And I also want to just thank our partners and supporters. And also, as this is the last event that we're going to be doing on susdrain before Christmas and New Year, just want to wish you all the best for the holidays and the New Year, and look forward to speaking to you then. So thank you very much for your time. Cheers, Julia.
Cheers now, everyone. Happy Christmas.